The mountains did not care about the cold. They never had. Snow buried the canyon trails 3 weeks early that year. Ice sealed the creek. The narrow walls of Varden Canyon stood silent, unreachable, forgotten, the way they had stood for 1,000 winters before this one. Then a thread of smoke appeared, thin, pale, rising from somewhere inside the stone itself. Not from a campfire on the canyon floor, not from a cabin on the ridge above, from inside the wall. A 19-year-old girl with $23 and a brass compass the size of a walnut had found something in that mountain, something that had been sealed away for 15 years, something warm in a place that had no right to be warm. She didn't know yet what it would cost her to keep it. She didn't know yet how many lives depended on whether she could. The smoke kept rising, and somewhere on the ridge above a man in a heavy coat stopped walking and looked down. She was 19 years old, and she had $23, not almost 30, not close to 30, 23, exact. She'd counted it twice in the parking lot of the gas station 2 towns back, standing in the kind of cold that makes your fingers go dumb before you even realize it's happening. $23 and a brass compass the size of a walnut and a blanket that smelled like the back of a closet that hadn't been opened in years. That was everything. No family, no plan, no forwarding address because nobody had asked. She was 19 and she was walking north, and what nobody knew, not the woman behind the gas station counter who watched her leave without buying anything, not the truck driver who didn't stop when she put her thumb out, not anyone in the valley she was leaving behind, was that her father had been inside that mountain before her, and he had left something waiting. She just didn't know it yet. Her name was Maren Solvik. And this is the part of the story most people get wrong. They hear it later, hear the version that gets passed around Draven's Crossing over coffee and across back fences, and they think it's a story about a lucky girl who found a warm cave, or a brave girl, or a stubborn girl who refused to lie down and die. It wasn't any of those things. It was a story about a father who loved his daughter in the only way he had left to him, which was quietly, from a distance, in the form of a compass and a crack in a frozen wall of stone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to go back to when she was small. Maren was 3, maybe just turned 4, when her father first showed her how to read the ground. She doesn't remember it the way you remember things you understand. She remembers it the way you remember things that live in your body instead of your brain. The feeling of his hand over hers, the cold of the earth under her palm, the way his voice sounded when it came from above her, from the height of a grown man crouching down to be closer to a small child. They were out past the back fence of the property before the pines got thick in that strange, in-between space where the grass gave way to rock, and the rock gave way to something older. Ira Solvik pressed his palm flat against a patch of earth that looked like every other patch of earth. "Feel that," he said. She felt it. Different. Not warm exactly, but not the same cold as the ground 3 feet away. There was something underneath it, something slow and patient and old. "Why is it different?" she asked. "Because something's moving down there," he said. "Heat, water, stone shifting the way stone shifts when you give it enough time." He stood back up, wiped his hand on his jeans. "Ground always tells you things. You just have to put your hand down and listen." She didn't know what to do with that at 3 years old, but she didn't forget it either. That's the thing about the things your father teaches you when you're small. You carry them around for years, not knowing what they're for, like a tool in your pocket you don't recognize, until one day you reach in and there it is, exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Ira Solvik taught her two things before he was gone. He taught her to read the ground, and he gave her a brass compass no bigger than a walnut shell, worn smooth on the edges from years of being carried in someone's hand. "This was your mother's before it was mine," he told her. "The way people say things they know are important but can't explain why yet. You keep it." She was 4 years old when he died. She doesn't remember the morning her mother sat her down and tried to explain it. She knows it happened because her mother told her about it years later, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. The compass was real. She'd had it her whole life. She'd carried it in her coat pocket the way other girls carried lip balm or spare change. She just didn't understand yet what it was trying to tell her. The compass lived in her left pocket for 15 years, through elementary school, through middle school, through the 3 years after her mother married Gideon Rush, and the house rearranged itself around a new center of gravity that didn't include Marin, through the silence that settled into the walls of that farmhouse like cold air through old insulation, slow and thorough and impossible to keep out. Gideon Rush wasn't cruel. She needs you to understand that, because the easy version of this story would make him a villain, a man who kicked a girl out into the snow because he hated her. That's not what happened. Gideon Rush was a man who didn't know what to do with a daughter that wasn't his, who had married a woman he loved, and then watched that woman get sick, and then watched her die over the course of 14 months in the bedroom at the end of the hall, who was, when it was over, standing in a house with a girl he'd never fully understood, looking at a farm he couldn't afford, trying to figure out how he was supposed to keep going. He wasn't cruel. He was lost. And when lost, people can't find their way. They sometimes just start clearing things out, not out of malice, out of exhaustion. There was a night about 2 weeks after the funeral when he sat down across from Marin at the kitchen table and put both his hands flat on the surface like he was trying to hold it down. "I can't do this on my own," he said. She waited. "The bank," he said. "Things with the bank." He didn't look at her. "You're old enough. You're 19. I thought maybe you'd have ideas about what you want to do next." Marin looked at him for a long time. She understood what was being said. That was the thing about growing up in a house where people communicated mostly in silences. You got very good at translating. "Okay," she said. Not agreement, not argument, just the word people say when they don't have anything else and they need to end the conversation before it gets to something neither of them is ready for. She went to bed. In the morning, her bag was packed and sitting by the front door, not by Gideon. She'd done it herself in the dark because she already knew, because she'd already understood the conversation, even the parts that hadn't been said out loud. She added the compass to her coat pocket. She counted the money she'd saved from the occasional weekend work she'd done at the hardware store 3 towns over. $23. She picked up the bag. She walked out. And here is the thing that most people don't know about that morning. Because Marin never told anyone. Because she was the kind of person who didn't volunteer the parts of herself that hurt. Before she got to the end of the driveway, she turned around, not to go back. She knew she wasn't going back, just to look. The house sat gray and quiet in the early light. One window upstairs with the curtains still drawn. The old pine by the front corner that had been there before any of them. The fence her mother had painted white 3 summers ago and that was already starting to peel. She looked at it for 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then she turned back around and walked. She didn't cry. She almost did. But the thing about not knowing how to ask for help is that it's usually connected to another thing not letting yourself break in front of anyone, not even yourself, not on a driveway, not where someone might see. So she put the almost crying in her coat pocket next to the compass and she walked. She was 2 miles out before she found the note. She put her hand in her pocket for the compass, just to hold it, which she'd been doing her whole life, the way some people hold a rosary or a worry stone, and her fingers found something else. Paper, small, folded twice. She stopped walking, unfolded it, her mother's handwriting, unmistakably, the way her letters slanted a little to the left like they were leaning into a wind, the way she pressed hard with a pen like she wanted the words to go through. One sentence. Find the Varden Canyon. Your father left something there for you. Maren read it 3 times. She stood at the side of a road in the early morning cold, $23 in her pocket, and everything she owned in a bag on her shoulder, and she read her dead mother's handwriting 3 times. Her mother had known she'd be standing on this road, had known she would need something to walk toward, had packed that note, tucked it into Maren's coat at some point during those 14 months of illness, or maybe earlier, maybe years earlier, and said nothing, held on to it, waited for the right moment to give it to her daughter without giving it to her herself. The right moment being after I'm gone. The right moment being when you have nothing else. Maren stood there for a long time, the kind of standing still that isn't rest, the kind that's really a storm happening completely on the inside while the outside stays very quiet. Then she folded the note back up and put it in her pocket next to the compass, and she turned north, because Varden Canyon was north. She knew this, had always known this in the vague way you know things about a place you grew up near but never paid much attention to. A crack in the mountains about 30 miles up, narrow, deep, the kind of place that got skipped in tourist brochures because it wasn't dramatic enough, too tucked away, too easy to walk past. Her father had worked up in those hills years ago, before she was born, in the mining operations that had mostly shut down by the time she was old enough to ask questions about them. She hadn't thought about it in years. Now she could think of nothing else. If you are reading this, find a story to listen to on your way, because the walk ahead of Maren Solvik is about to get long, and the weather is about to get bad, and there are about 3 weeks of hard going between the girl with $23 and the thing her father left for her in a mountain. But before we get to that, before we get to the cold and the snow and the 3 weeks of walking that changed everything, if you've been moved by the story so far and you've never subscribed to this channel, now is a good time, because the people who find their way to these stories usually need to hear the rest of them. And this one is just getting started. It snowed on the 4th day, not a little, not a dusting, the kind of snow that arrives like a decision someone made for you. Maren had been sleeping in an empty equipment shed she found unlocked off a dirt road, using her blanket and her bag as insulation and trying not to think about the temperature. She'd eaten a gas station sandwich and half a bag of crackers she'd bought with careful dollars she was trying not to think about spending. The snow changed the math. Before the snow, she had been walking towards something. After the snow, she was surviving towards something, which is different. Survival takes more out of you. It's less about moving forward and more about not stopping. But here's the thing about being the daughter of a man who worked in the earth. She knew things she didn't know she knew. She knew that moving water doesn't freeze as fast as still water, so when she needed to cross, she found the ripples. She knew that pine trees with low branches on the south side meant the north wind was strong there, so she slept on the opposite side. She knew, and this was her father's voice, very clear, the clearest it had ever been, that if the air smells like copper, it's going to get colder before it gets better. And if it smells like green things, even in winter, something is moving underneath. She smelled copper a lot those first 10 days. Green things not yet. She kept the compass in her hand more than in her pocket. Not because she needed it for navigation exactly. She knew north. She'd always known north. But the compass was warm from her hand, and the weight of it was steadying. Some things you hold not because they guide you, but because they remind you that you exist. The roads thinned out, then disappeared. The trees got thicker, the light got shorter. She went through the $23 in increments in small gas stations and one convenience store where the woman behind the counter didn't ask questions and didn't say anything when Maren stood in the heat of the store for 7 minutes longer than she needed to, just standing there, absorbing warmth, like a plant absorbs light. She needed to not be asked how she was doing. People asking her how she was doing was the one thing she was genuinely afraid of. Not the cold, not the dark, not the running out of money. The question, because she might answer it honestly, and she could not afford to do that right now. She was very okay, very much handling this, completely fine. She told herself this so many times it stopped sounding like words. 13 days out, she hit a stretch of trail marked on an old wooden sign as Varden Access. The sign was weathered down to almost nothing. The trail behind it was under a foot of snow. She stood there looking at it. Then she started walking. The canyon announced itself as a feeling before it announced itself as a place. That's the only way to describe it. She'd been following the trail, or where she thought the trail was, under the snow for 3 hours. The trees had shifted from the broad-shouldered pines of the lower slopes to something older and tighter trees that had spent decades figuring out how to hold on to stone. The light was the gray-gold color of late afternoon. Everything smelled like cold and bark, and the particular mineral sharpness of rock that has been wet for a long time. And then there was a moment, a gap in the tree line. She stepped through it and the land dropped away, and the canyon was there, just there, like it had been there her whole life waiting for her to show up. It was narrow, dramatic in the way of things that have been shaped by patience and water rather than by any single event. The walls rose on either side, layered with color rust and gray and a deep greenish black where the moisture stayed. A stream wound along the bottom, half frozen, making the sound water makes when it's trying to keep moving despite everything working against it. Most people looking at this canyon in winter would see a dead end. Too cold, too narrow, too isolated, the kind of place you'd turn back from. Maren stood at the edge for a long moment, then she climbed down. It was on the second afternoon in the canyon that the woman appeared. Maren had set up what she was already calling camp in her head, though it was really just a place where the rock overhang was wide enough to keep the snow off and the stream noise was close enough to hear, but not so close that the damp crept in. She'd built a very small fire, eaten the last of what she had, which wasn't much. She was sitting with her back against the canyon wall compass, open in her hand, watching the light do what late afternoon light does, in narrow places fall, at an angle, turn the stone gold for about 20 minutes, then go. She did not hear the woman coming. She simply looked up, and the woman was there, 70-something, maybe older, dressed in more layers than should have been possible to move in, and carrying a pot by the handle, an actual pot, a cooking pot, emitting steam. Maren stared at her. The woman looked at the fire, looked at the blanket, looked at Maren in the way that older women sometimes look at younger women who are clearly in over their heads, not with pity, exactly, with the particular quiet recognition of someone who has been in over her own head before and remembers what it felt like. "People get lost up here in the winter," the woman said. Her name was Dorothea Brigg, though Maren didn't know that yet. "I figured someone might need this." She held out the pot. Maren's hands were very cold. The pot was steaming. There was a smell coming off it that she didn't have a word for other than warmth turned into food, and Maren said, "I'm fine." Just like that, automatic, the way a reflex happens before the brain catches up. "I'm fine." The two words she'd been saying her entire life. Because asking for things was dangerous, because needing things was a weakness, because her whole life she'd been in a house where needs made people uncomfortable and it was safer to not have any. "I'm fine." The woman didn't argue, didn't push, didn't say, "Are you sure?" or "You don't look fine," or "It's no trouble." She set the pot down on a flat stone next to the fire, and she walked away, didn't turn around, didn't wait, just went back the way she'd come, her boots quiet in the snow, her shape getting smaller, and then gone around the bend of the canyon wall. Maren looked at the pot. The pot steamed. She looked at it for a long time, long enough for the evening to start coming down, and for the fire to need another stick, and for the cold to press in from 3 directions at once. Then she picked up the pot, and she ate, every bit of it, standing up because sitting down felt like she'd surrendered to something, standing up with the pot in both hands, feeling the warmth of it move through her palms and up her arms and somewhere toward the center of her chest, where the cold had been sitting for 2 weeks. She didn't know yet that she would see Dorothea Brigg again, that this was not the last pot, that Dorothea had been watching the smoke from the canyon for 2 days before she decided to come down, had stood at the rim and looked for a long time before making up her mind, had carried that pot down a trail she hadn't walked in winter in years. She didn't know any of that yet. She just ate and didn't say thank you because the woman was already gone. And maybe, just maybe, some part of her was grateful for that the kindness had come without a face attached to it, without the debt of eye contact, without anyone seeing her need it. Some of us need to be given things anonymously for a while before we learn to receive them any other way. That's not a flaw. It's a wound that looks like a preference. The warm air found her at 2:30 in the afternoon on her 3rd day in the canyon. She was not doing anything significant. That's always how it happens. She was picking her way along the base of the eastern wall, looking for a better spot to fill her water bottle from the stream, and she stopped to check her footing on a wet stone. And there it was, a current of air against her left cheek. She went very still. The canyon was cold, had been cold for days, the kind of cold that exists in places where the sun only reaches the floor for a few hours a day, if that. Her breath had been visible every moment she'd been down here, but this air, it was not exactly warm. She didn't want to oversell it, but it was different, not as cold, moving, coming from somewhere. She turned slowly, tracking it, the way her father had taught her to track things with her whole body, not just her eyes, nose, skin, the fine hair on her arms, the compass in her pocket. She pulled it out and held it open. The needle spun, not dramatically, not like something out of a movie, just a slight tremor it didn't usually have settling back to north, but with something different in the settling, something under the ground, moving, heat. She followed the air. The canyon wall looked ordinary. That was the first thing. It looked like every other section of canyon wall she'd been walking past for 3 days. Rock, ice, a curtain of frozen moss, some stones piled by an old landslide. She almost kept walking. Instead, she stopped, pressed her palm flat against the rock, the way her father had pressed his palm flat against the earth behind the back fence all those years ago. Warmer, not imagined, measurably, honestly, verifiably warmer. She moved along the wall, testing, pressing, following the temperature the way you'd follow a trail in the dark, one hand at a time, and then behind a shelf of ice that hung down like a curtain from an overhang, she hadn't noticed she found it. A crack, not small, not large enough to see at first, but when she shifted the ice shelf aside, carefully careful because it was heavy and she didn't want it to fall there, it was a gap in the rock, narrow, the kind of narrow that requires you to turn sideways and make yourself into the thinnest version of yourself. Warm air came through it in a steady, gentle exhale, like the mountain was breathing. She stood there for a long time. Then she put the compass back in her pocket, took off her bag, held it in front of her, and turned sideways and went in. What the crack opened into was not what she expected. She'd expected a narrow pocket, a shelf of rock where the air happened to be trapped, maybe 3 feet deep, maybe 4, something small and disappointing and fully explainable. She got something else. The crack opened, not gradually, suddenly, like a held breath release. The walls pushed back and the ceiling lifted, and she was standing in a space that was... She turned slowly, arms out, trying to measure it with her body, maybe 30 feet across at its widest. The ceiling was high enough that the lantern would not have reached it, even if she'd had a lantern. The floor was dirt and flat stone, reasonably level. The walls were dark rock, the color of charcoal with a faint sheen where moisture had once moved through them and left its mineral signature behind. And it was warm, not summer, not anything you could call comfortable in a conventional sense, but dramatically, measurably, impossibly warmer than the canyon outside. She pulled off her outer glove and held her bare hand in front of her. The air moved against her skin like something tame, like something that had been here a long time and had learned to be still. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. She just stood there, turning slowly, breathing the underground air that smelled like stone and old moisture and something she couldn't name, something mineral and deep, something that had been sealed in here since before she existed. And then she saw the shelves. They were against the far wall. What was left of them? Boards gone gray and sagging, some collapsed entirely, some still holding their shape by stubbornness alone. Old boards, old hardware, not something that grew here, something someone had carried in and fixed to the wall with intention. Someone had been here, not recently. The boards were years old. The collapsed sections had fallen long enough ago that the dust on them had dust on top of that dust. But someone. She moved toward them. Her foot caught on something in the half-dark. She crouched down. Her hand found stone, then cold metal. A shape, rectangular, smooth. She lifted it. A box, plastic, hard-shelled, gray, or what had once been gray before. The years had turned it to something more like the color of old bone, sealed with a latch that she felt rather than saw. She sat down on the floor of the cave. She held the box in her lap. The warm air moved around her. The compass was steady in her pocket. She thought about her mother's note. One sentence. Your father left something there for you. She thought about her father's hand pressed flat against the earth behind the fence. Heat, water, stone shifting the way stone shifts when you give it enough time. She thought about how a man who works in the earth for 20 years learns things about what's under it, learns where the warmth lives, learns where to go when everything above ground has failed you. She opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilskin that had done its job perfectly for years, was an envelope. She lifted it out. The envelope was sealed. Her name was not on it, but there was a name in the corner in handwriting she had only ever seen on one other piece of paper. Handwriting she recognized immediately from the birthday card her mother had kept in a shoebox under the bed, a card she'd found at 11 years old, written in the year she was born. That careful handwriting, those letters that pressed hard and leaned slightly left, her father's, Ira Solvik, and beneath his name a date, 15 years ago, not long before the morning her mother sat her down at the kitchen table and tried to explain to a 4-year-old girl that some people have to go. Maren sat in the warm underground air of the Varden Canyon with her father's name in her hands. She did not open it, not yet, not right now, because some things you hold for a moment before you let them change you. She pressed the envelope to her chest. The oilskin was cool, the box was cool, but the air around her was warm, this strange underground warmth that had no right to be here in the middle of a mountain, in the middle of winter, that existed because of something moving deep in the earth, patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to human grief. Her father had found this place, had come here, had built those shelves, carried those boards in through that narrow crack, had made something out of this cave that was more than a cave, had been here in this exact spot where she was sitting now, on the same dirt floor. She put her hand flat against the ground, warmer than the ground outside, always had been. Something moving down there, her father's voice said, from a morning 15 years ago, in a garden she could no longer fully picture. Heat, water, stone shifting. Ground always tells you things. You just have to put your hand down and listen. She listened. Outside the canyon, the temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. The stream was quieter now, more of its surface locked under ice. The sky above the narrow gap between the canyon walls had gone the color of pewter, heavy and low. Night was coming, and farther up the ridge, though Maren could not see this, could not know this yet, a figure had stopped moving. A man in a heavy coat carrying gear who had been making his way across the ridgeline when something caught his attention, something small, barely visible, the faint wavering thread of smoke rising from the canyon below. He stopped, looked down. The smoke was there, thin, real, coming from inside the canyon, which meant someone was down there, which meant something had changed in the timeline he'd been working from. He stood on the ridge for a long moment. Then he turned and walked on, but his pace was different now, deliberate, the kind of pace you keep when you are a man who has just learned he needs to adjust his plans. Down in the warmth of the underground chamber, Maren Solvik held an envelope with her father's name on it and did not open it. Not yet. She was not ready yet, but she was going to be. And the mountain was patient. It had been waiting 15 years. It could wait one more night. She opened the letter in the morning, not because she was ready, because she'd been awake since 3 in the morning, and at some point the waiting became worse than the knowing, and she picked up the envelope and she opened it. Her hands didn't shake. She was proud of that. In the way you're proud of small, stupid things when everything else is too big to look at directly. The oilskin had done its job. The paper inside was dry, white going to cream at the edges, the way paper does when it's been sealed away from air for a long time, aging in the dark, patient, as everything else in this mountain seemed to be patient. She unfolded it, her father's handwriting, the same hand from the birthday card, careful, precise, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a man who spent his career documenting things, recording, making sure the measurements were right. Older, maybe, the letters slightly smaller, like he was trying to fit more in. She read it slowly, and then she read it again, and then she sat very still in the warm underground air of the Varden Canyon with the letter in her lap and the compass in her hand, and she said nothing for a long time, because what the letter said was this. His name was Ira Solvik. He had worked in mineral extraction for 22 years. He had started as a surveyor's assistant in his early 20s and worked his way into something that had a longer title than it needed, which was essentially this. He was the man who went into the places that weren't on the map yet and decided whether they were worth putting on the map. He had found the Varden Canyon thermal pocket in the early years of that work, walking a survey line for a company that was looking for something else entirely and finding this instead. This warmth, this underground breathing, this chamber that had no business existing where it existed, heated by a geothermal current that ran through the rock 100 feet below the floor she was sitting on. He had documented it, officially, filed a report, registered a mining claim with the Federal Land Office the way you did when you found something in the earth that might be worth something, which this was, not for the reasons most things were worth something, but for a reason he'd put in the report and in the claim paperwork, and that had been, he wrote, promptly ignored. The company he worked for had been bought, reorganized. The people who would have read his report were replaced by people who had other priorities. His claim sat in a filing system that moved from paper to database, and somewhere in that move, his name fell out of the attached documentation. He was let go. Standard language, economic restructuring, nothing personal. He had tried to fight it. For a while, he didn't have the money for a lawyer who could take on a corporation, and the corporations knew this, and the people at the company who had liked him and thought he'd done good work felt bad, but not bad enough to help. He had come back to the canyon instead, not for the first time. He had been coming here since he found it, this place that kept its warmth even when everything else was cold, that didn't care what the company thought or what the filing system had lost or what the restructuring had decided. He had built the shelves, brought in supplies in small loads, carefully over several seasons, had spent weeks here, had he thought of it as the most honest place he had ever been, a place that did what it did, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. Then he'd gotten sick, and after that there was a different kind of math, the kind you do when time is the thing you're running low on, rather than money or options. He'd written the letter, sealed the box, left the compass with his wife, and written the compass will tell you the rest when you're ready. Look at the back. The numbers there are the claim registration, Federal Land Office, Bureau of Land Management, Western Division. The claim has never been formally released, which means it still belongs to whoever holds it, and now it belongs to you. Then the last line before his name, written small, like he'd almost left it out and then decided it was the most important thing. The earth doesn't forget what it's given. Men do. The earth doesn't. Ira Solvik. And a date 15 years gone. Maren sat with the letter for a long time. The warm air moved around her. The compass was in her hand and she turned it over, which she had done 1,000 times in her life without thinking about it, just the habit of turning it, feeling the worn edge. The back was smooth, always had been, always felt like nothing, except She held it closer to the light coming in through the crack, tilted it, numbers, tiny, careful, pressed in, not etched with a tool, pressed with something pointed like a compass needle itself, patient and precise, one character at a time, a claim number, a division, an office designation. She had been carrying her inheritance in her pocket since she was 4 years old, and she had not known. She sat with that for a while, the way you sit with things that are too large to absorb quickly, the way you don't cry immediately when the thing is big enough, because crying requires the brain to have processed what happened, and the brain is still just standing there in the doorway of the information, not quite inside yet. She put the letter back in the oilskin, put the box in her bag. She pressed the compass into her palm, hard, both hands, like she was trying to transfer something from the metal into her skin. And then she got to work, because here is what Maren Solvik did. Instead of crying, she worked. Not because she was avoiding something. She was absolutely avoiding something, but also because the cave needed work and she needed to be useful. And when you don't know how to let yourself be a person who receives things, you become a person who does things. And doing things was the one currency she'd always been able to earn. She cleared the collapsed shelves first, moved the broken boards to one side, saved the ones that still had some structure, found that 2 of the original supports were still solid against the wall, anchored by someone who had known what he was doing, set deep enough into cracks in the rock that they'd held despite years of no maintenance. Her father's work, holding. She fixed 2 boards across the remaining supports, not beautiful, functional. She organized what she had, which wasn't much, but organizing it made her feel less like a person who had nothing and more like a person whose things were in order. She explored the chamber further. It went back farther than she'd seen in the dark, 20 feet deeper on the eastern side, narrowing but not closing the ceiling, dropping but not enough to make you duck. The warmth was consistent throughout. She pressed her hand against the back wall and felt it there too, steady as a pulse. Her father had mapped this. She could see marks on the walls, faint weathered, down to almost nothing. Survey marks, the kind she recognized from old photos of mine sites, diamond shapes, and lines, the shorthand of people who worked underground and needed to communicate quickly in dark places. His marks, 15 years old, still there. She traced one with her finger. She had not thought about Ira Solvik as a person in years. She had thought about him as an absence, a shape in the family story that wasn't filled in, the way children of people who die young think about their missing parent as a concept, as the thing that would have been there and wasn't. Now she was standing in his work, and she understood something that she hadn't had language for before. He had been real, specific, precise. A man who pressed measurements into the back of a compass and documented thermal currents and built shelves in the dark, who came back to a cold canyon because a warm mountain chamber had become the truest place he knew, who had thought of her at the end. She sat down on the floor of the cave, and she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, the way people cry when they've been holding it for a long time, and they're finally somewhere private enough and warm enough to let it happen. She cried for her father, who she had never really known. She cried for her mother, who had carried the note for years and said nothing. She cried for the girl who had walked out a driveway with $23 and a compass she didn't understand, and somehow ended up exactly where both of her parents had always been pointing her. And when she was done, she wiped her face on her sleeve and stood up, and that was that. That was the one time She spent 4 days inside the mountain before anyone else came. 4 days of work, of building, of making the space into something that could be used. She reinforced the entry crack, not to hide it, to make it safer. The ice shelf that hung down over the opening was unstable, and she brought it down herself carefully in pieces and found that without it, the crack was more visible but also more accessible. She widened the bottom slightly. With a stone tool she improvised, and 3 hours of patient work, a person could get through it now without losing skin. She built a second sleeping platform. From boards she found deeper in the chamber, in a collapsed pile. She'd almost missed old boards that must have been a second project her father had started and not finished. They were dry, solid. She organized, clean, made decisions about the space with the part of her brain that had always quietly noticed how spaces worked, how air moved, where to put things for them to be found. Some things skip a generation in their naming, but not in their reality. The townspeople of Draven's Crossing started talking on the 3rd day. She didn't know this. She found out later, from Aldous. But apparently a trapper named Sven Mar had gone up the Eastern Trail for reasons of his own and come back with a story about smoke rising from inside the canyon walls, which he reported at the general store with the confidence of a man who'd been living in these hills long enough to know that smoke didn't come from inside canyon walls, which led to the theory that the canyon was on fire somehow, which was physically implausible, which led to the second theory proposed by a woman named Judith Praske, who had opinions about everything and shared all of them freely, that someone had moved into the canyon, which she pronounced in the tone of a person announcing a small and localized catastrophe. Who would do that? A transient, probably. Dangerous, maybe. Something should be done. Marin knew none of this. She was building a second shelf and thinking about water storage and wondering whether the spring her father had mentioned in the letter was really 200 steps northeast, or whether his sense of distance had been particular to his longer stride. It was closer to 230 steps. She found it on the afternoon of the 4th day, following the direction the letter had given her, counting, and there it was, seeping through a crack in rock that was slightly warmer than the surrounding stone, the water not quite freezing because of the thermal activity below. Cold, clear, real. She stood there looking at running water in the middle of a frozen canyon in the middle of winter, and she thought, okay, maybe this is survivable. Maybe this is more than survivable. It was on the 5th morning that she heard footsteps outside, not careful footsteps, not the footsteps of someone trying to be quiet, the footsteps of someone who had been walking a long way and was tired and wasn't thinking about noise. She went still, every part of her. She had been sitting near the entrance crack, the morning light coming in a thin blade, reading the letter again. She folded it, put it inside the oilskin, put the compass in her pocket, and waited. The footsteps stopped. Long pause, then a voice. "Hello." She said nothing. "I can see the fire smoke." Another pause. "I'm not gonna bother you. I just need to know you're not dying in there." She thought about that. "I'm not dying," she said. Another pause. "Okay," the voice said. Footsteps again, getting quieter this time, moving away. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she let herself breathe. His name was Aldous Fenwick, but she didn't know that yet. She learned it 6 days later, which was the second time he came. He was 67 years old. He had a face that looked like it had been weathered by the outdoors and then re-weathered by more outdoors and then left in the sun a few extra years just to be safe. He walked with a slight favoring of the left knee that he would tell her later was a very boring story involving a very steep trail and a very wrong step that had happened 20 years ago, and he'd been meaning to get it looked at. He sat down on a rock outside the cave entrance, not inside. She had not invited him inside. She sat on a different rock, 10 feet away. They sat for a while. "You've been here about 10 days, he said. 11. You're Ira's girl." She looked at him. "Ira Solvik," he said. "You've got his look around the eyes, and you're in his cave, so." He shrugged, the shrug of a man who had done basic math and gotten a basic answer. "You knew him, worked with him. 20-some years ago, he found this place during a survey I was running." A pause. "When I heard someone had moved into the canyon, I thought," he stopped, started again differently. "I have something that belongs to you, if you're his." "I'm his," Maren said. It was the first time she had said those words out loud. "I'm his." She hadn't known they would feel like that, like claiming something. The next morning, Aldous came back with a box of his own. Not a dramatic box. A regular plastic file box of the kind you buy at office supply stores. Dusty, labeled in marker that had faded to barely legible. He set it down in front of her. "He asked me to keep it," Aldous said. "Years ago when he got sick, he said he had a daughter somewhere, and if she ever came looking, I should give it to her. I told him I had no idea where she was or what she looked like." A pause. "He said she'd find the canyon first, that she'd know where to go." He tapped the box once, then stepped back. Maren opened it. The documents were carefully organized, the way a surveyor organizes things, by date, by reference number, by category. The original field report on the Varden thermal pocket, the mining claim, registration, federal form, fully completed, every field filled in with that careful handwriting, signed, dated, stamped, and under that something she hadn't expected, correspondence, letters her father had written to the company after his termination, letters to the regional land office, letters to 2 different attorneys who had in different ways told him the same thing, formal final, "we are sorry," but language. He had tried. He had tried for almost 2 years, and then he had stopped trying to fight the company and started doing something different. He had started protecting the claim itself, because the filing was real. The claim number pressed into the back of the compass was real, and a mining claim under the General Mining Act her father had written in a note attached to the top of the file does not simply expire. It must be formally released. It must be actively abandoned. And he had not abandoned it. And as long as he had not abandoned it, and as long as no heir had abandoned it, the claim remained. And in the bottom of the box, tucked beneath everything else, a small sealed envelope, her name on the front, his handwriting. She almost missed it. It was thin, felt like not much inside. She put it in her coat pocket next to the compass. Not yet. That one she would open when she was ready for it. "Did you read all of this?" Maren asked, meaning the file documents. "Yes," Aldous said. "Then you know what it might mean." "I know what it might mean," Aldous said carefully. "If the claim is still valid, if the land office records match." He stopped. "There's something else," she said, not a question. "There's a company that's been buying up access rights in this valley," he said, "for the past year or so, quietly, through intermediaries. They've been asking about the canyon, asking who owns the adjacent land. The adjacent land, the land the Rush farm sat on." Maren felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite a feeling yet, more like the beginning of a shape of a feeling. "Gideon," she said. Aldous looked at her steadily, said nothing, which was answer enough. She didn't go back down the valley. She wanted to, but she didn't go because the snow came back. Not a flurry, not the manageable inconvenience of regular winter snow. The kind of snow that the people in Draven's Crossing would talk about for the next 20 years as the benchmark of bad. It started on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the trail into the canyon was gone, not obscured, gone. The kind of erasure that happens when enough snow falls fast enough that the landscape underneath becomes theoretical. You know it's there. You can't see it. By Friday afternoon, the temperature dropped below what thermometers in the valley were designed to measure reliably. Maren knew it was coming before the snow started. She'd smelled it. Copper and cold stone and something older underneath. The particular atmospheric pressure change her father's teachings had written into her bones without her knowing. She'd spent 2 days preparing, consolidating firewood inside the chamber, filling every container she had with water from the spring, reinforcing the entry crack against wind intrusion with pieces of the old boards and a section of her blanket she could sacrifice. She was ready, or as ready as a 19-year-old girl alone in a mountain cave in the middle of the worst storm in 20 years could be, which was mostly. She was mostly ready. The first knock came on Friday night, not actually a knock, more a sound against the rock outside, a sound that was too irregular to be the storm and too deliberate to be a falling branch. She went to the entrance. Outside in the narrow band of canyon, visible through the crack, the snow was moving sideways. The temperature hit her face like a flat hand. Standing in it, barely visible, were 2 people, old, both of them, a man and a woman, the Hellers. She would learn their name before the night was out. The woman leaning into the man, and the man leaning against the canyon wall, and both of them doing that thing cold people do, where they're no longer shivering because they've been cold long enough that even shivering has become too much energy. Their stove, the man managed, broke. That was all he said. Their stove broke. Maren stepped back. Come in. She didn't think about it, didn't calculate, didn't weigh it. Some things happen in the body before they happen in the mind, and this was one of those things. Come in. The door opens. That's what doors are for. They came through the entrance crack slowly, Mrs. Heller first, Mr. Heller guiding her and then following, and when they got inside and the temperature difference hit them, she stopped walking. She stood there. She looked at the chamber, the shelves, the fire, the ceiling that disappeared into warmth and shadow. She put her hand on the wall. It's warm, she said, not loudly, barely above a breath, like she was reporting back to herself from a very long distance. The mountain, Maren said. She put them by the fire, gave them what she had, didn't count it. Mrs. Heller fell asleep sitting up within 20 minutes. Mr. Heller watched her sleep with the expression of a person who has been watching someone they love navigate danger and is now briefly allowed to stand down. He looked at Maren. Thank you, he said. 2 words. She nodded. She sat across the fire from them and watched the entrance and listened to the storm and didn't sleep. They came the next day and the day after, not in groups, in ones and twos, in one family of 4, mother, father, 2 children, so bundled they barely looked like children, just shapes of bundling, who arrived all together in the early afternoon, the father carrying the younger child, the mother keeping the older one moving through the last 100 feet of trail that was barely trail anymore. Dorothea Brigg was the 3rd person through the entrance. Maren didn't know it was her at first, didn't recognize the shape of her in the dark and the snow, But when the layers came off and the face appeared, Maren knew, the woman who had left the pot. Dorothea looked at the cave, looked at the fire, looked at the family of 4 and the Hellers and the 2 other people who had arrived that morning, looked at Maren. "Well," Dorothea said. That was all, but the way she said it, the way she said, "well," it contained something that Maren did not know how to receive in the moment, but that she would carry for the rest of her life. It contained, "I see you," and I knew, and the world surprises me sometimes in the good direction. Dorothea had brought food. Of course she had. A bag that she had clearly been packing against the possibility of needing to shelter somewhere, filled with the practical provisions of a woman who had lived long enough to know that emergencies are not theoretical. She started organizing without being asked, which was how Maren understood that she was not alone in running this place anymore. She almost said something, almost said, "I don't need help." Almost. She closed her mouth. Let Dorothea organize. One of the quietest battles of Maren's life, and she won it by doing nothing. The one she hadn't expected came on the 5th night of the storm. Maren was at the entrance doing a check of the seal when she heard someone outside. One person, footsteps heavier than you'd expect, which meant someone in boots made for real weather, moving carefully, too carefully, the kind of carefully that comes from knowing the terrain rather than from being uncertain of it. She waited. The knock was firm. She opened the entrance. Judith Praske, 58 years old, the woman who had within 3 days of hearing about Maren's presence in the canyon announced at the general store, the post office, and what Maren would later learn were 2 separate phone calls that a transient had moved into the canyon walls and something should be done about it. Who had used the word dangerous? Who had used the word situation? Who had, most recently, according to Aldous, who had told Maren this on his 2nd visit, said that the girl was probably squatting illegally and someone should look into it. Judith Praske was standing at the entrance to the cave in the worst storm in 20 years, with ice in her hair and a look on her face that was the most human Maren had ever imagined her looking, because Maren had only imagined her as a voice until now. Scared, just scared. She was just a scared woman in a storm. There was a long moment. Maren looked at her. Judith looked back. The wind made its opinion known between them. Maren stepped aside. Judith came through, and not a word was said about anything that had been said before, because some conversations don't need to happen when the weather makes the argument for you. Judith sat down near the far edge of the group, away from the fire, at first, and then gradually closer, because cold eventually wins every argument. Maren watched her for a moment. Then she went back to the entrance to check the seal. She had a cave full of people to keep warm. She could process the absurdity of it later. Aldous came on the 6th day, nearly fell through the entrance. She caught him, both hands. He was not dressed badly. He was not underprepared. He was just 67 and had walked 3 miles in weather that had no business being walked in, and his left knee had made its displeasure abundantly clear. She got him to the fire, gave him her own spot closest to the heat. He sat there for 10 minutes before he spoke. Then he said the company sent someone. She looked at him. Before the storm got bad, he said, day before yesterday, a man with paperwork. He was asking around town about the canyon, about who had been up there recently, about the claim status of the land. What kind of paperwork? The kind, Aldous said carefully, that says they have a right to assess the property. Access agreement signed by the adjacent landowner. adjacent landowner, Gideon. She had known it was coming, somewhere under the storm and the work and the people arriving and the managing of supplies and the not sleeping she had known. Aldous, she said, the claim documentation, the registration number. Is it enough? He looked at the fire for a moment. It might be, he said, if it hasn't been superseded, if the land office records still show it as active. When can we find out when the storm breaks? How long? He looked at the entrance. The sound of the wind outside was the sound of something that had decided to stay. Few more days, he said. Maybe, she nodded. Few more days. She could do few more days. In the meantime, she had 17 people in a cave and firewood to manage and a spring to keep accessible. On the 7th evening, Aldous was sitting across from her while most of the cave was asleep, the fire low, the mountain doing its patient underground work around them, and he said something she carried with her after. He looked at the people sleeping, the Hellers, the family, Dorothea, even Judith on her side, her breathing, the slow, reliable breathing of someone finally warm enough to let go. He told me once he wanted this place used like this, Aldous said quietly. She looked at him. Ira. He told me he found it during a bad winter, bad enough that he'd stayed 3 nights because he had nowhere else to be. He said, and this is almost exactly what he said, this place saved me once. I hope someday it saves someone else. He didn't say anything after that, neither did she. The fire made its small, careful sounds. The mountain breathed. Outside, the storm had begun just barely, just at the edge of perceivable too slow. And somewhere under the floor, they sat on deep in the rock. A current of heat moved through the earth the way it had been moving for 10,000 years, indifferent to weather, indifferent to debt and companies and filing systems and the names that get dropped from documentation, not indifferent to the people sitting above it, and Maren Solvik sitting in the warmth her father had found and documented and tried to protect and finally left for her in the only way he had left to him, thought about what it means to leave something for someone you love, about what it means to trust that they'll find it, about what it means to be found by something that has been waiting for you your entire life. The storm eased, just slightly, just enough. Tomorrow things would begin to move. The storm broke on a Thursday. Not gradually, not the way storms are supposed to end with a slow loosening, a gentle release. It stopped the way it had started, like a decision. Maren woke to silence, real silence, the kind that has texture to it after 7 days of wind, the kind that presses against your ears the same way sound does because your body has recalibrated to noise, as the baseline and quiet as the aberration. She lay still for a moment, 17 people breathing around her. The fire burned down to coals, the underground warmth doing its patient work in the walls, in the floor, in the air that moved so gently through the chamber. It was more like a suggestion of air than air itself. She got up without waking anyone, went to the entrance, pushed through the crack, and the canyon was white and gold and completely still. Sunlight at the top of the eastern wall, just the edge of it, moving down slowly the way sunlight moves in narrow places, like it's being careful, like it knows it's not always welcome here, and it's trying not to overstay. She stood in the canyon with her boots in the snow and her coat half buttoned and the compass in her hand. She breathed. Cold air, clean, the mineral sharpness of snow on rock. Underneath it faintly the smell of green things, the thermal current from below exhaling. Her father's canyon. Her canyon. She turned the compass over in her hand, looked at the back, the tiny pressed numbers she had been carrying her whole life without knowing what they were. Today she would find out if they meant what Aldous thought they meant. She went back inside to wake Aldous. He was already awake. Of course he was. 67 years old and a bad knee and 7 nights on a cave floor. He was sitting up with his coat already on the file box, open in front of him, squinting at a page in the thin light from the entrance. "Storm's done," she said. "I heard. Can we get down to the valley?" He looked at the entrance crack, made a calculation she could see happening behind his eyes. "By midday," he said, "if the main trail isn't drifted too deep. And the land office closes at 5. He looked at her. "We'd make it." She nodded. She started to turn. "Marin," she stopped. "If the claim is still valid," he said carefully, "it doesn't automatically solve everything. There will be a process. The company will have lawyers. I know. I just want you to, Aldous." She looked at him. "I know. I'm not expecting it to be simple." A pause. "I'm just expecting it to be true." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and closed the file box. People woke slowly, the way people wake when they've been running on fear and cold and survival instinct for a week, and suddenly the threat has lifted and their bodies remember what rest is supposed to feel like. The Hellers woke together the way long married people do. Almost simultaneously, he reached for her hand before he opened his eyes. The family with the 2 children. The kids woke first, because children always do, because the world is still interesting to them before it has a chance to be exhausting. The younger one, a boy, maybe 5 years old, walked straight to the entrance. Crack looked through it and announced blue. Just that. Blue. The sky was blue. It shouldn't have been the thing that broke the tension in the room, but it was, because sometimes all a room full of frightened people needs to exhale is a 5-year-old saying, "The sky is blue like it's news worth reporting." Dorothea laughed first, then the mother, then slowly with the particular reluctance of a woman who had spent her whole life maintaining a certain public dignity, Judith Praske. Marin watched them from near the entrance and felt something. Not relief exactly, not pride, something quieter than either of those. Something like, "This is what the mountain was for. This is what my father meant." They started filing out by 10 in the morning, slowly, carefully. The snow was deep, but the trail was findable if you knew where to look, and Aldous knew where to look and walked in front so the others could step in his tracks. Mr. Heller paused at the entrance. He was the last of the others to go. He looked at Marin. He looked at the cave behind her, the shelves her father had built and she had repaired, the fire that had burned for 7 days, the ceiling that disappeared up into warmth. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Your father built something worth building." She opened her mouth, closed it. He nodded once and turned and walked into the snow. She stood in the entrance and watched them all go. One by one, the shapes of them getting smaller as they moved down the canyon. The family, the couple, 3 others who had arrived in the middle days and whose names she had learned, but whose faces she was already afraid of forgetting. Dorothea last. She stopped at the first bend, turned back, looked at Marin. "I'll bring something hot tomorrow," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." A pause. "I'm going to." And she turned the corner. Gone. Marin stood in the silence of the empty canyon for a moment. Then she looked at Aldous, who had come back up to stand beside her. "Ready," he said. She pressed the compass into her palm. "Yes," she said, and they walked down. The land office was in a building that smelled like carpet an old paper, and the particular institutional warmth of government heating. A woman at the front desk looked up when they came in. They were wet. They were trail-worn. Aldous had snow still on his left shoulder that he hadn't noticed. The woman at the desk looked at them. Then she looked at the file box under Aldous' arm. "Can I help you? We need to check the status of a mining claim," Aldous said. He put the registration number on the counter. The woman typed. The sound of keys, the sound of a computer doing something, the fluorescent lights, the carpet, the old paper smell. Marin stood very still because this was the moment, this specific moment in this specific fluorescent lit room that smelled like carpet was the moment the whole thing either held together or it didn't. And she had no control over it. She had done everything she could do. She had walked 30 miles. She had found the cave. She had kept 17 people alive for 7 days. She had opened the box and read the letter and figured out the numbers on the compass and gotten here before 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. And now she was standing at a government counter waiting for a woman she'd never met to tell her whether any of it meant anything. This is the part nobody tells you about inheritance. It's not the finding. It's the waiting to find out if the finding counts. The woman typed something else, looked at the screen, typed again. "Solvik," she said. IRA Solvik. "Yes," Marin said. "Mining claim Varden Canyon, thermal survey designation." More typing. "This claim has not been formally released." She looked up. "It's listed as active." The room was very quiet. "Active," Aldous repeated. "The annual maintenance filings lapsed about 12 years ago, which puts it in a particular status category. It's not invalidated, but it's what we call administratively dormant, which means you'd need to file a reinstatement application with supporting documentation of air status. But the underlying claim itself has not been abandoned. Not been abandoned, because Ira had not abandoned it, because Ira had pressed a number into the back of a compass and given it to the woman he loved and trusted the mountain to do the rest. Marin put her hands flat on the counter, not dramatically, just to have something solid under them. "What do we need to file?" she said. The woman looked at the box under Aldous' arm. "Do you have the original registration documents?" Aldous set the box on the counter. "Yes," he said. "They were there for 2 hours. Forms, documentation, the original field report, which the woman disappeared into a back room with and came back from looking slightly different, slightly more alert in the way of someone who has just seen something older and more significant than their usual afternoon. Marin signed things, more things. Her hand got tired. At one point, Aldous leaned over and said very quietly, "You're doing fine." And she almost said, "I'm fine," which was the automatic response, the reflex. But she stopped herself. "I know," she said instead, which was different, which was new. They were walking back to Aldous' truck when the other car pulled into the lot. Black, clean. The kind of clean that doesn't happen when you're actually driving in winter conditions, which meant it had come from somewhere close and hadn't been on the roads during the storm, which meant whoever was in it had been waiting. 2 people got out. Suits, coats over suits. The coats were expensive. The boots were not made for this terrain, which told you something about how long they expected to be standing in it. One of them held a folder. The other looked at Marin and Aldous with the expression of someone who had done this before and expected it to go a certain way. "Miss Solvik," the man with the folder said. She stopped walking. He knew her name, which meant they'd been asking around, which meant they'd been watching longer than she'd realized. I represent Carrick Valley Resource Group, he said. We have an access agreement with Gideon Rush for the adjacent. I know who you are, she said. He paused, recalibrated. Then you know why we're here. I do. The canyon access has become a matter of… We just came from the land office, Marin said. Pause. The Solvik claim, she said, has not been abandoned. The reinstatement application is being processed. She looked at him steadily. You're going to want to talk to your lawyers about that before you finish that sentence. The man with the folder looked at the man without the folder. The man without the folder looked at the building they'd just come out of. A long moment. The kind of moment that happens when people who are very used to winning have to do a rapid calculation about whether this is still a situation where winning is available to them. We'll be in touch, the man with the folder said. I'm sure you will, Marin said. They got back in the car. The car pulled out of the lot. Aldous watched it go. That was, he said after a moment, considerably smoother than I expected. I was terrified, Marin said. I know. My hands were shaking. I know, I couldn't tell. She looked down at her hands, still shaking slightly, the particular shake that happens not during the hard thing, but immediately after, when the body finally gets permission to process what just happened. She put the compass in her palm and held it. The shaking slowed. The compass did what it had always done, held. The thing she hadn't expected was Caspian Vor. He came to the canyon 3 days after the storm. She heard him coming from inside. Same boots she'd heard on the ridge that last evening before the snow hit. Same careful but not quiet pace. She was reinforcing the second shelf, which had developed a lean she didn't trust, and she stopped what she was doing and waited. He came through the entrance without asking, which was a choice. She let it be a choice. He was 44 years old, and he looked like he'd been outside for most of those years. Big through the shoulders, a face that had made its peace with weather. He stood in the entrance of the cave and looked around with the expression of a man who is seeing something for the first time and recognizing it anyway. Bigger than I thought, he said. Most things are, Marin said. He looked at her. She looked at him. You know who I am, he said. I know what you were doing up on that ridge. A pause, long enough to be honest. Yes, he said. She waited. The company hired me to do a site assessment. He said, find access, map the approach, report whether there were any obstructions. He said the last word with a flatness that told her he knew what word the company had used for her. Obstruction. I was going to file the report the morning the storm hit. And then you didn't. And then I didn't. He didn't give her an explanation right away. He said, I stayed in a cave like this once, years ago. I was younger, stupid, got caught out on a bad trail in a bad season and found a hollow under a rock shelf that was just barely warm enough. He looked at the walls. Nobody knew I was there. Nobody came. He paused. I made it out because the cold got less worse for 3 days and I kept a fire going. Silence. I kept thinking, he said, about what it would have been like if someone had come. Another pause. I've thought about it for 20 years. She looked at him for a long time because she understood this. Not the exact experience, but the shape of it. The way a thing that happened to you alone gets carried forward as a question. What if someone had come? What if someone had known? What if there had been a door to knock on instead of just cold? The company's lawyers are already working on a response to the claim filing, she said. I know. You talked to them. They called me. He looked at her. I told them I couldn't verify that the access route was unobstructed. A pause. Which is true. I couldn't. I was inside the cave. She almost said thank you. Almost. But it wasn't quite ready yet. There's a second sleeping platform, she said instead. If you need somewhere to be. He looked at the platform. I have a cabin, he said. I know, but I could come back. He looked at the entrance. If you need someone who knows the upper trails. She thought about that. Maybe, she said. He nodded and left, which was the right amount of conversation for two people who communicated primarily in what they didn't say. The thing she had expected was Gideon. She had expected him since the morning she'd left the driveway, had been expecting him the way you expect weather you can read, coming the feeling of it on the back of your neck days before it arrives. He came on a Saturday, 10 days after the storm broke. She was outside the cave in the canyon splitting a piece of wood that was too wet to split cleanly, but that she was splitting anyway because the motion of it was useful when her brain was too loud. She heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of a person not sure of their footing on uncertain ground. He appeared around the bend in the canyon. He looked smaller than she remembered, not physically. He was still a large man, big through the chest, hands that had spent 40 years of farm work, and it showed in the shape of them. But he looked smaller in the way that people look smaller when you see them outside of the context where they've always held authority. The kitchen table, the farm, the specific gravity of a place where you are the person who decides things. Here he was just a man standing in a canyon in snow boots that weren't quite right for the terrain. He stopped 10 feet away. She kept her hands on the wood. Marin, he said. Gideon. He looked at the cave entrance, looked at the split wood, looked at her. I heard what happened, he said. During the storm, people in town. He stopped, started again. People are talking about it differently now. She waited. I signed papers, he said, with the company, the access agreement. He looked at his hands. I didn't know about your father's claim. I didn't know the canyon was connected to. He stopped again. She looked at him. The thing about Gideon Rush was that he was not a liar. That was perhaps the most complicated thing about him. He wasn't lying now. He genuinely hadn't known, or hadn't let himself know, which was different from not knowing, but could look identical from the outside. You needed the money, she said. Yes. For the bank. Yes. And you didn't tell me. He met her eyes then, for the first time. No, he said, I didn't tell you. The canyon was very quiet. Wind moved through the upper reaches of it, far above their heads, the sound of it distant and small. Why, she said, and she meant all of it at once. Why didn't you tell me about the debt? Why didn't you tell me about the sale? Why didn't you tell me about my father? Why didn't you say any of the things that might have made any of this make sense? He was quiet for a long time. Because I didn't know how, he said finally. Just that. I didn't know how. Not an excuse, not a justification, just the plain flat truth of a man who had spent his entire life knowing how to do physical things and not knowing how to do the other kind. She thought about that. She had spent 19 years in a house with a man who didn't know how to talk about the things that mattered. And she had responded by becoming someone who also didn't talk about the things that mattered. Who said, I'm fine, when she meant I'm scared. Who refused soup when she meant thank you. Who walked out a driveway without turning back when she meant I needed you to stop me. They had taught each other all the wrong things, without meaning to, without either of them noticing until it was too late to unlearn it in the ordinary way. The company's lawyers are fighting the claim filing, she said. I know. Aldous is working with a legal aid office in the city. They think the reinstatement is solid. I know. He paused. I told the company I was withdrawing the access agreement. She looked at him. They said I'd have to return the payment. Can you? No. He looked at her steadily. But I'll figure it out. Silence. The split wood between them. The canyon walls on either side. The cave entrance behind her, warm and quiet in the morning. I know who my father was, she said. Just that. Nothing more. But the way she said it, the way the sentence landed in the cold air between them, it was not an accusation. It was not a door slamming. It was something more complicated than either of those. It was a line drawn, not between her and Gideon, between who she had been before she walked into this canyon and who she was now, between the girl who didn't know where she came from and the woman standing in her father's work, in her father's warmth, holding her father's compass. Gideon heard it. She could see him hearing it. He nodded once. Then he looked at the cave entrance one more time. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. She watched him go until he was gone around the bend. Then she picked up the wood and the axe, and she went back to work. The lawyer settled faster than Aldous expected, which was the first good sign. When lawyers for a company move quickly in response to a claim, it usually means one of two things. Either they think they can crush it fast, or they've read the documentation and they know the claim has merit and they want to settle before it becomes a precedent. It was the second one. Aldous called her on the third Tuesday after the storm. They're offering a settlement, he said. Acknowledge the claim status. Agree not to pursue canyon access in exchange for dropping any counterclaims. She was standing at the spring, filling the water container. The sound of the water was the sound of the mountain working. Are there counterclaims? She said. There are the beginnings of some interesting questions, Aldous said, about whether the company knowingly purchased access rights over an active federal claim. Would they be expensive questions for them to answer? Very. She looked at the water moving through the crack in the rock. 10,000 years of this. The water finding the crack, the heat rising through the stone, indifferent to paperwork, patient in the way of things that don't need to hurry because they know they're not going anywhere. Tell them yes, she said. That's it. That's it. She hung up and stood at the spring for a long time. Dorothea came every Thursday after that, with food always, different things each time, and once on a Tuesday with nothing at all. Maren was inside when she heard the footsteps. She came to the entrance. Dorothea was standing there with empty hands. I just wanted to see how you were, she said. Maren looked at her, said nothing for a moment, then said, come in, and Dorothea did. And they sat by the fire and Dorothea talked about things Maren did not have context for yet people in Draven's Crossing, the history of the canyon, the winter her husband had died 4 years ago, and the specific kind of quiet that lived in a house after that. And Maren listened and occasionally said something back, and the fire did what fires do, which is be warm and provide something to look at when looking at another person directly is more than you can manage. It was the first conversation Maren Solvik had finished without wanting to leave. The letter from the Bureau of Land Management arrived 3 weeks later. She read it standing at the cave entrance. Official, government letterhead, the language of bureaucracy, which is its own kind of language, flat and procedural, and utterly indifferent to human feeling. The reinstatement application had been reviewed and approved. The Solvik mining claim, Varden Canyon Thermal Survey designation was hereby recognized as active. The registered heir, Maren Solvik, was the claim holder of record. She read it twice. Then she folded it, and she took out the small sealed envelope that had been in her coat pocket since she first opened the file box, the one with her name on it, his handwriting. She sat down on the sleeping platform. She opened it. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs, which was somehow worse than if it had been long, because you could see that he had chosen every word, had left out everything that wasn't necessary. The first paragraph was practical, about the claim, the compass numbers, what to do and in what order. She had already done all of it. The second paragraph was an apology. He did not apologize for dying, which was the right choice because dying was not something he had done to her. He apologized for not knowing how to stay in touch after the illness started, for letting her mother be the one to hold all the weight of the explanation that would have to come later, for writing a letter instead of being there. I know this is not enough, he wrote. I know that a letter is not a father. I am leaving you the best version of a letter I can write, because it is the only thing I have left that is entirely mine to give. And the third paragraph, she read the third paragraph 3 times. I watched you once. You were 3 years old. You were following a line of ants across the garden, and you were very focused on them, and you did not step on a single one. You went out of your way. I was watching from the window, and I thought, she is careful with things that matter. She will know what to do. I hope the compass finds you well. Your father, Ira. She sat with it for a long time. The way you sit with things that took a long time to arrive and are over too quickly once they're there. Then she folded both letters together, the BLM letter and her father's, and put them in the oilskin. Put the oilskin in her bag. And she cried, for the same reasons as before, and new reasons and reasons she didn't have words for yet, which were maybe the most honest reasons of all. She cried for the 3-year-old who hadn't known she was being watched, who hadn't known she was already being loved from a window. She cried for the father who wrote a letter instead of being there and knew it wasn't enough, and wrote the best version of it he could and trusted the mountain to make sure it arrived. And she cried for herself, just a little, just the amount that 19-year-olds are allowed to cry when they have walked 30 miles alone in the snow and kept 17 people alive in a cave and found out that everything they needed was waiting for them all along, and that the whole time they thought they were unloved, they were actually just not yet found, not yet, but found now. Spring came slowly, the way it comes in mountain places, tentatively, testing. A warm day followed by a cold week, followed by 2 warm days, followed by a night that reminds you not to trust it yet. But it came. Snow pulled back from the canyon floor. The stream grew louder. New things appeared, a moss on the shaded rock that wasn't there in winter, slow and green and patient, a bird in the upper reaches of the canyon walls that she heard for 3 mornings before she saw. On a morning in April, she was standing outside the entrance with the compass in her hand when she heard someone on the trail. Caspian. He'd been coming by once a week since the conversation after the storm, not to stay, not to ask for anything, to walk the upper trail and report back about conditions, about who was moving through the area, about what the land looked like after a hard winter. Useful things, practical things, the language of a man who didn't know how to be useful in the other ways and was trying the only one he had. She understood this language fluently. He came around the bend and looked at her standing there with the compass. Anything, he said, meaning the slight tremor it sometimes had when the thermal current was particularly active below. A little, she said. He nodded, came to stand beside her, not close, just near. They stood in the morning canyon, and she thought about her father standing here, on this floor, pressing his palm flat, feeling the warmth that nobody was supposed to believe in, writing it down anyway, filing the paperwork anyway, pressing the numbers into the back of a compass anyway, because he was careful with things that mattered. Because sometimes what you leave behind is not money and not land and not even love exactly, but something simpler and stranger than any of those things, a habit of attention, a way of pressing your hand against the ground and listening, a small brass instrument that tells you which way north is and that has numbers on the back that mean here. This is where. This is yours. She looked at the compass one more time, turned it over. The numbers, his numbers, her numbers. She closed it, put it in her pocket, where it had always been, where it would stay. She was 19 years old. She had $23 when she started. She had found a crack in a frozen canyon wall. She had followed the warm air through, and on the other side of it was her father's life's work, and her father's words, and a winter that tried its hardest to make her believe she was alone in it, and failed because of 17 people and one elderly man with a file box, and one woman who brought soup and didn't wait to be thanked. It was the best $23 she ever spent, not because it bought anything, because it was what she had left when she started walking toward the only place that had ever been waiting for her. And the mountain kept it warm until she got there.